All right, y'all. We are getting ready to have our final conversation in our series around legislative session. And I have my guest, Ms. Joie, for maybe 9 months. And we have officially, session has officially adjourned. So Sine Die is without a day, and legislative session is officially out. And now, through our community conversation series, we are going to take a deep dive into what actually happened this legislative session. So I am Fran, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Black Collective, and I am here with Christina Francois, who is also, hello.
Hi, everyone.
And yeah, and so we're just gonna jump straight into it because there's just so much to talk about. So again, for those if you're not familiar with the Black Collective, next slide. We are a movement, and we are committed to promoting a shared agenda to elevate the political consciousness and of course amplify the economic power of our Black communities. This is being recorded and we will be working with interpreters in English, in Spanish and in Haitian Creole to get this up for our communities. And so just know that this recording will actually be trilingual and it'll be up on our YouTube channel, and we will make sure to let y'all know when we actually upload it up to our channel. Next slide. So what actually happened? Chris, I don't know if you want to take kind of like the first stab at this, but there's definitely a lot that happened this legislative session. We know that this was one of the most historic monumental budgets of about $112 billion that was actually passed in this legislative session. And with that, we know there it was because there were billions in federal dollars that was actually part of this through the American Rescue Plan that was basically used again to really help within the education sector, being able to increase the salaries of our teachers and different people within the schools. We know that unfortunately, there were a lot of issues that were on the table that are really impacting Floridians when we talk about housing, when we talk about increases in home insurance and auto insurance, expansion in Medicaid. There are many things that were unfortunately overlooked this legislative session. And so we want to just be able to take a deep dive into what actually passed this legislative session. And again, these are based on the legislative priorities of the Black Collective.
Yes. So as we often say, Florida is the testing ground for lots of legislation that ends up being copied across the country. And unfortunately, many of the items that passed will have been introduced either across in other states or will be in the future. So if you have watched any news, you've probably heard of a couple of these. The first, and I think the one that we're going to talk about quite a bit, is around what we deem this white fragility bill that really limits how we can talk about race and gender in our state. Not only is it that they're literally banning educators from being able to talk about certain topics in the classroom, but really even limits how educators can speak with students. So HB 7 is the bill. HB 7, SB 148, HB is being House bill, SB being Senate bill, that passed both chambers. Limits the ability to teach LGBTQ history, Black history, and really the historic reasons why we discuss gender and race. The first thing is that we no longer can talk about gender, but sex, which is, quote unquote, biology versus gender and gender expression. And then instead of race, we're talking about color, which for me, I don't know when y'all hear that.
You might want to move to the next slide, Chris. So they can see the
Here we go. Yes, so you can see it. Yeah. So for me, I'm like, if we can't talk about ethnicity, like what is color? We don't get assigned a color. It's like this bill really does a lot of the progress that we've made in the areas of gender and race. I mean, it really is a step back. And all of this is framed in wanting to protect folks from feeling guilt and anguish. And we know what folks they're trying to protect from: psychological distress.
And if you go to the next slide, one of the other things that you'll see is that essentially this bill really is stopping within training, within instruction for students and employees to really be able to talk about issues and topics of white, basically white supremacy. And we know that in this moment where we are in this country, where we've been able to really be able to have some very hard conversations about our history, the history of the United States. How was it actually built? Like fundamentally, like what was it built upon? And we know that it was about one race being superior to the others. And so this essentially is saying that you can't really talk about the moral superiority of members of a race, and at the same time, you can't really discuss privilege or or oppression. So again, this goes back to like when we talk about white privilege and we talk about systems, we talk about systemic, institutional, structural racism, which privileges one group of people and ultimately harms other groups of people, and mostly Black people in this country. We know that system, like when we talk about redlining, when we talk about how people have access to certain mortgages through certain banks, and the racism that exists within financial institutions, through employment, the fact that we have to, basically pass laws in the past to actually protect certain groups of people. Essentially, in Florida, they're saying that we can't really talk about, who is privileged and who is actually oppressed. And if you go to the next slide, one of the other things that was very interesting, because this was, again, part of the debate that was happening, was around, how do we talk about, because a lot of the members on the floor who were in support of this bill kept talking about supporting, facts, and really being able to talk about facts about history. And we were like, what are the facts that you're talking about? And so essentially they were like, we want to support the stories of inspiration. And it was like, and I remember one of the members on the floor, one of the Black members on the floor was like, what stories of inspiration? Like, how do we talk about what was inspiring of overcoming slavery if we can't talk about slavery? Right. How do we talk about what was inspirational about the Holocaust if we can't talk about like what the Holocaust actually was and the lives that were lost in that process? And so they literally just kept saying, well, we can talk about inspiration. We're just asking them to talk about stories of inspiration and individual freedom and how people were able to prosper.
Which also, it's like individuals were not responsible for slavery. Like it's not like, yes, I mean, to a certain extent, rights were conferred to individuals who were freed, but like that was not because of individual action. Like, I don't know. It is very dangerous. And not only is this going to be impacting our education system in our state, but also employers. So one of the things that you may have seen, and for example, it took a long time for the Disney CEO, which we could talk about Disney at another time. But for example, one of the reasons why they did finally speak out is that this would basically ban their entire diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative that they have as required training for their employees. So not only is this limiting what we can talk about in primary school or in the education system, it's also limiting what employers can include in the professional development of their employees. And again, this undoes years, if not decades, of work that has been done to be able to make work environments more inclusive and less hostile and more culturally competent. And is, as we know, an entire industry that a wide variety of folks participate in. So that's the first one. Okay, so the other bill that was rather controversial, which is rather controversial and harmful to our communities, is SB 1080. Wait, sorry, 1808, SB 1808, which is an immigration enforcement bill, and it does a couple of things. One of the most concerning parts that got a lot of national and local attention, that actually got a diverse coalition of folks speaking out against this bill, is around the transportation of undocumented children. So this penalizes any municipality and any state-funded nonprofit, basically.
Yeah, and any company, yeah,
that does business with a company that transports undocumented children who have been released from immigration custody. The other side of the bill is that, and this has been really a 10-year fight to prevent, and unfortunately, we lost, mandating that every single county in the state of Florida have an immigration enforcement contract with the federal government, deputizing our state and local law enforcement to actually enforce our immigration laws, regardless of the type of police interaction it is. So whether you're a victim, whether you're whether you're interacting with the criminal justice system in any way, they are required to inquire about your immigration status and report you. Basically, that's the simplest way of explaining it. So I don't know.
And again, this is an unfunded mandate, because again, like for years, local police officers have basically said that they don't want to have to do the job of federal immigration enforcement, because the biggest concern is the level of trust that's going to be lost between them and community. And again, this has literally been a 10+ year fight, going all the way back to the Arizona copycat, and really being able to successfully push back against that. This again goes back to like, what were the priorities of legislative session? And again, it was literally about harming our communities and really creating an environment for immigrants in the state where they feel unsafe. And anybody who is actually willing to step up and support them. And as you can see from the headline, Governor adds the Archbishop, and he's talking about Archbishop Winsky, who was actually my priest, baptized me, communion, confirmation, and who is now the Archbishop here in South Florida, adding to his enemy list, because again, like the church was very adamant, faith leaders across the state were very adamant about what you're putting in place is not allowing us basically to fulfill what our responsibility is of our mission. And it was unfortunate to see that this was something that was prioritized, and that it did move after putting up a fight for almost 10+ years, that we saw that this actually moved this legislative session. And so the next bill that also passed this session, which is we are framing it as the Ending Local Freedoms Bill, is essentially a bill that creates the process for businesses to sue local governments if they feel that an ordinance essentially is harming the profit of that business, if they feel that they've been hurt and impacted, and has caused them to have about a 15% reduction in their business revenue. It essentially creates a process for businesses to sue local government. And this is, again, more so to chill the effects of local government, who are actually passing really good policies around responsible wages, around increasing minimum wages, a lot of wage issues when we talk about around housing and really trying to figure out the ways to address housing. This really is meant to really kind of slow them down. And so there is a lot of work being done right now to really ask the governor, to tell the governor to veto this bill, because again, we can't continue to have these issues of preemption and state interference that is really harming the government that is closest to the people to actually meet the daily needs of their constituents.
Right. We can't prioritize business revenue over the quality of life of Florida residents, ultimately. Brian, you want to do this one?
Yeah. So the next one was, again, another one that we were very vocal around fighting. And this is around criminalizing neighborhood presence. So this is an extension, essentially, of HB1 that really just bans or criminalizes protesting in a neighborhood. And so this, again, just kind of like the backstory of this is that this really kind of came up during the time of Derek Chauvin and the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. And he had a summer home here in South Florida. I don't know if, Chris, like the freeze is happening just on my side. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, and so it was just, again, this whole residential picketing and again, like really trying to stop people from exercising their First Amendment right. And this was very unfortunate to see that this was a bipartisan bill and it was supported across the aisle. And this will create a second-degree misdemeanor. So this second-degree misdemeanor is a maximum of 60 days in jail, $500 in fines, and 6-month probation, and for the mere presence in a neighborhood. Because again, the main concern of this bill and the other bill, as you can see, of like the Senate signs off on the crackdown against pop-up events, is that protests could be considered a pop-up event. And now we have two bills that could potentially become law on their way to the governor's desk that essentially is going to criminalize protesters and at the same time make protesters pay the cost of having to get police officers out to basically patrol the special event zone, which essentially is a protest. So these two bills, again, we're being very vocal around our opposition. You can see that the Black Collective was able to get an op-ed published in the Sun Sentinel. And we're just, again, going to continue to push back on this, as well as we continue to push back with our HB1 lawsuit against many layers of why that bill was, why that law is a really bad law.
And I think one of the themes really is the consistent restriction, all of the restrictions placed on our First Amendment right to, demonstrate grievance, vocalize our grievance against the government is a slippery slope. So they're like chipping away at where you can protest, how you can protest, associating a cost to protesting. And this is a constitutionally protected right. And so folks should really, obviously our HB1 lawsuit is still underway, and you can keep posted on that by following us on social media and our website. We actually have a landing page dedicated to HB1 updates. But we are really dedicated to making sure that we could do anything we can to protect really the tactics that are the most effective for our community. They're not choosing these new restrictions out of nowhere, right? It's because they work. They actually do lead to systemic change and perception and changes in policy and perception. So
yeah, and mind you, again, like we always have to kind of always lift up is that when we talk about fundamental principles of democracy and have basically the right to dissent, and the fact that this is something that we're seeing happening not just in Florida but across the country, and laws like this that are being passed is like, again, goes back to what Christina is saying around the slippery slope of basically criminalizing the right to dissent, which again is like a key principle of democracy. And so this is something that we definitely have to continue to keep our eye on if they're going to continue to criminalize basically people's right to protest and people's right to assemble. But we will definitely keep you all posted on this, and again continue to keep you all posted around what's happening with the HB1 lawsuit. So from here, some of the other bills that passed this legislative session were the Don't Say Gay bill. I'm sure many people heard a lot around that. And this was, again, talking about classroom instruction and classroom discussions around gender identity. And essentially what this debate came down to was a lot of people who just don't feel that we should have conversations around gender identity in schools, and that students should not have access to these types of conversations. But the most concerning thing about this, and literally, again, remember watching the debate around this, is that people were pointing out that you're putting schools and you're putting school administrators and teachers in a position where they may have to out children. And because, and again, do you know the environment in which that child lives in their home, where they potentially could be put out on the street? And I remember, I believe it was a senator who said, well, some kids get put out, but not all do. And I was like, okay, so again, we fight for abortion. You all are fighting for the, anti-choice
Right to
fight,
life.
but the right to life and anti-choice. But when they're here, you could care less about them and how they live and what they have access to. That it was so dismissive that some may get kicked out of their homes, but not all. And the teacher has a right to, like, if for some mental reason that they feel that this child may harm them. And I'm just like, and we know the statistics around LGBT children and the high rates of suicide compared to those of their peers. And this bill is essentially setting that up, and to create a more hostile environment for these children. We also know that the abortion ban passed, and this is really one of the strictest ones that we have, one in the history of the state, but it seems like a trend that is building out in the South between Mississippi, which I believe was a 6-week ban, Texas, the 15-week ban. We know the Dobbs ruling is coming up anytime this summer around abortion access. And again, Florida basically decided to jump on the bandwagon for that. And so Florida did pass a 15-week ban, and there was a lot of fight around this too. Again, it's around protecting the access of women to make choices, the choices that they need to make, and they only should be the ones to make them, and government has no right to interfere within that process. But unfortunately, that's what we saw was prioritized this session. We also talked about net metering.
One point about that. So one of the things that folks should keep in mind is that when we have constitutionally protected rights and laws are passed at the state level or the local level that challenge or restrict that, normally, oh my God, it's so cute. Yeah, there goes a smile. Normally what happens is that the law stands unless there is a lawsuit, right? So someone has to take it upon themselves to challenge these laws. And once the laws are challenged, it works its way up the court system to eventually go to the Supreme Court. The issue is the composition of our current Supreme Court. So many of the bills, there's a super conservative super majority is how I frame it, where if any of these make it to the Supreme Court, it could codify the horribleness of the law. So again, like, this is a strategy. So they're not choosing the state of Florida arbitrarily. We have a circuit court, and that is conservative. So even if we won at the state level, if it goes to the circuit court, it will probably be stricken down. Then you again appeal into the higher workings of the judicial system. So I want folks to keep in mind that these bills are outrageous. They need to be challenged, but them being challenged does not necessarily mean that it's
basically, there's a plan at play, and there's a goal to potentially overturn Roe v. Wade. And again, the states that you see, very traditionally red states of Mississippi, Texas, and Florida, leading the way around some of the strictest abortion laws, anti-abortion laws in the country, is because they're trying to trigger a potential overturn of Roe v. Wade, because for the first time in a very long time, the Supreme Court is ultra-conservative with a majority enough
around abortion,
around abortion
and identity and race, right? Yes. So yes.
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, so the other bill that passed again was the net metering bill, and this essentially is not just about gutting rooftop solar, but it's just, again, this whole thing of the David and Goliath story of corporations versus the interests of the consumers and the people. And because we know right now, again, that people who have solar panels, they essentially are getting excess energy that they're able to either sell to the utility companies or basically offset their costs. And essentially what's being created through this bill is a process that ends that. So that even if you have this excess, I believe it's by like 2029, they're gonna have the Public Service Commission essentially vote on how do we not subsidize energy anymore. And it always kind of goes back to the, when we have these conversations about tobacco and like it wasn't until the tobacco companies wanted to get into weed that we now saw that the industry of marijuana is this booming industry, because it's basically it's on their timeline. And so the same thing feels like it's becoming true of solar, is that utilities, until they decide that they no longer want to use coal, they no longer want to use natural gas, that they want to shift to solar, it is on their time so that they can profit from it. But right now, the consumers are the ones that are actually reducing their costs, their excess costs that we're seeing across the country, and being able to use solar, but it's not on their timeline, so that they were able to get, again, the majority in the legislature to support this bill. And so advocates are really calling for a veto of this, because essentially this will crush the small businesses that are running solar panel companies. And many of them came to the Capitol, like hundreds of them came up to the Capitol, really saying that, do you understand how this is going to harm our companies, our businesses? Because people are not going to see the benefit of rooftop solar, because there's really not going to be anything in it for them. So that, again, that was one of the ones that passed this session with very vocal opposition to it. And also what was passed, school board term limits. So now 12-year term limits are in place for school board members. We know that across the country, across the state, we've had school board members, some of them who've been in office for over 20 plus years. And so this now triggers a 12-year term limit. One of the good things I would say, because again, we don't want to be doom and gloom this whole time, one of the good things that was taken out of this bill was around their salaries, because that originally was part of this language, was that they actually wanted to cap the salaries of school board members to like about what state legislature. One of the bills had it taking their salaries away completely. So then we know what kind of parents who would actually have the time to be on a school board, because this is like 24/7, all day, every day, having to be present for this job. And one of them also was trying to have them at the state legislature salary. Mind you, they're only in session 60 days. But school board members are working every single day to make sure that our children have what they need. And they were going to try to drop it to $29,000 a year. And so they stripped that language, but they kept the term limits. And then in the process, also created a process for book approvals, which essentially we're calling a book ban, because it's going to create a process in which parents who don't want their children to, be reading the books that are clearly, again, and Chris, you and I, our generation, we didn't have a lot of books that, we could see the child with the afro. We didn't see that representation. And my daughter's generation, they're seeing that representation. And so what now allows a process where parents can challenge what books are actually allowed in the school.
It's not just limited to parents. So I, as somebody who has no children, am able to challenge a book that is being taught. That is actually one of the most nefarious parts of this bill, because, conservative activists, I will say, are the ones who are the most likely to show up to a school board meeting and the most likely to be heard. And so on the one, if we wanted to put a positive spin on it, it's an opportunity for, Black parents to be able to advocate. I think there's an opportunity for Black parents to be able to advocate for things that they find harmful in the classroom. And I think that definitely organizations that are working on education and youth, if you are really passionate about this issue, definitely plug in to organizations like Power U and PS 305. But we know that in practice, this is disproportionately going to restrict the teaching and visual representation of Black history and Black folks in our education system. And again, this is something that is being introduced across the country, and is a national strategy. And then the last one, friend.
Yeah, and so the last two is, again, soil and water conservation districts, basically a bill that passed that created restrictions on who is actually eligible to serve on soil and water districts to people who were involved or retired after working 10 years in agriculture. So essentially, academia, environmentalists, and other climate experts who normally serve on these boards, again, to make sure that when we talk about the environment, when we talk about climate, that we're looking at it from an equitable lens and really speaking the truth about science, are not going to be allowed to serve anymore. And then the Senate also passed the new election securities bill, which essentially is a voter suppression bill that creates this new Office of Election Crimes and Security. And really it goes back to, again, all the things that we heard in 2020 about the elections being stolen, that there was fraud, and that people were voting who weren't supposed to be voting. And it will lead to a purge of the voter rolls. And so that's one of the things that we can really highly recommend and suggest, is that you continuously check whether or not you are registered to vote in your county, because the purges are going to be increasing. And again, this is about really limiting who has the access to vote.
And remember, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, this is the year where we are voting on everyone who is not the president. Everyone from hyperlocal to, you know, your Congress folks, because of redistricting. So again, there is a vested interest in having as little people as possible vote.
Yeah.
Because many of these are brand new districts and they don't necessarily know what the outcome. There's no incumbent. There isn't really an incumbent advantage. This is another way for
it's a clean slate. We're walking into like a clean slate where everybody has to compete for their seats. Yeah, and so then what didn't pass? Because again, while there are many bad things that did make it through, that clearly have harmful impacts to our students, to our teachers, to workers, to small businesses, there were many things that also were part of our legislative priorities that we were able to be vocal around with different community partners and stakeholders across the state, that we were able to successfully stop this legislative session. So some victories, I guess we could say, around stopping some really bad bills. And so we know that the fees in lieu of security deposits bill was one that almost passed, actually died, I believe, in one of its last committees of reference. Chris, if you can go to the next slide. And this was, again, goes back to this was a bill that was supported, again, across the aisle, bipartisan support. And this was a bill that was being led by a corporation. The corporation is called Lease Lock. And so this is a bill that, although it was defeated this year, we have to keep an eye on it for next year. And the main questions that people had around this was that, well, why shouldn't we support people being able to give a monthly rental fee instead of having to pay that lump sum security deposit? And I want people to understand that different housing advocates across the state really tried to work with the legislature to get them to understand the harm in which the way that the bill was written. And because what happens is that, yes, you're paying a monthly fee, but the day that you decide to move out, your landlord could then seek payment for damages. So again, security deposit is basically like a protection of like okay, if things were messed up in the apartment, then keep the money and I'm going to move out. But now you're going to pay a monthly rental fee that probably will be in excess of what your security deposit was going to be for that one-time payment. And then when you're moving out, you actually have other monies that you're still responsible for paying. And then conversations were had around like creating an escrow so that the monthly fees were going into an account that was going to be held until someone decided that they no longer wanted to, lease at that particular building, but they weren't open really to looking at the protections for the renters. This was more so a bill that was going to protect landlords and protect large corporations, large landlord corporations. And as, like I said, you can see Lee Slock was the one who actually came in, proposed the bill, wrote the talking points, wrote checks to the bill sponsors. So this was kind of like bought and paid for, but they didn't deliver. And so it's most likely something that we can see will come up next legislative session. Yeah.
Yes. And it's another one that, again, is being introduced across the country. So we always want to pay attention to what's going to be a Frankenstein, right? Like what's going to come back from the dead. But luckily we were able to defeat it. The next one.
Yeah. And then again, for the second year in a row, we were successful in stopping House Bill 11, which is essentially would have criminalized people like Darnell Frazier, who recorded the last moments or the murder of George Floyd, because if a police officer basically would have came up to you and be like, you need to back up, you need to stop recording me. And if you didn't back up and stop recording, then they could have arrested you right there. And it would have been a second-degree misdemeanor also. So again, 60 days in jail, 6 months probation, up to $500 in fines. And so we were able to be successful in not getting this bill heard, not in one committee. It was not heard. But again, that means they could be setting up for next year because, again, they got certain bills like, again, criminalizing protesters. And so this we feel is still like an extension of HB1 as well, because us documenting the excessive force and abuse of police officers is part of like our stance around protesting. And so we have to keep our eye out that this bill may also actually come back up next legislative session.
But this was definitely a win. Like this
definitely
was
a huge win.
Really dangerous in the year.
And it was being highlighted as something that potentially was going to pass. Like,
this was and it was a priority bill.
Yes.
So this is actual, like, I know that, most of this is doom and gloom, but this is something that we should really be proud of in terms of being able to defeat it.
And when we say that it's a priority bill, it's because you can tell just by the number, like by how early it was filed. So like House Bill 1, that was the number one priority for last legislative session. So this was House Bill 11. So it was still up there in the top 20 bills that was priority for the leadership in the House. And so the fact that, again, it was not heard, not in one single committee. And again, through the budget process, we still have to keep our ears to the ground to make sure they didn't slip it in to any kind of criminal justice package, budgeting package reform. And so, and the fact that, again, they didn't even try to sneak it in was that, okay, we were successful this year, and that is amazing, and that is great. And so we definitely have to keep the pressure on because we need to make sure that next year this does not move an inch once again. And also what didn't pass was the preemption on local responsible wage ordinances. This, again, would have been a blow to our workers, because essentially what this bill was going to be was that we know that companies who contract with the locality, so like with a city or a county, they set responsible wage ordinances where it says that in order to get this contract, you got to pay your workers this amount of dollars, whether it's $15 an hour, $20 an hour, because to get our government contract. And so what was basically going to happen with this bill, if it had passed, was that it was going to drop to what the current minimum wage is. So just imagine a worker working, getting paid $20 an hour because they got a government contract. And then the next day, if this bill had passed, was going to be dropped to $10 an hour, which is what the current minimum wage is in the state of Florida. And so this was going to be a huge blow, and it was going to be a huge loss money-wise to the economy and to, again, the wages of workers across the state of Florida. And so we're very happy to see that this bill did not move an inch, and it ultimately died in the committee process. And so again, this is something that we're going to have to keep our eye on for the next legislative session. So I think we're about done talking about all the bills. Oh yeah, yes. Oh yeah, that was one of the other ones. Yes. Oh gosh. Remember, we talked a lot.
We talked a lot about this.
About this bill. It was two of them. One was around increasing the threshold from 60% to 67%, so that, if a ballot measure is put before the Florida voters, they would have to have gotten 67% of the vote in order for it to become law. That one did not move an inch. And the other one then was going to be around limiting the subject matter only to issues of the state. So essentially would have impacted future minimum wage ballot initiatives, future medicinal marijuana ballot initiatives, rent control initiatives, all of these different things that would have impacted Floridians, because at the end of the day, the legislature is responsible for really being able to improve the quality of life of Floridians across the, across our state. But what happens is that when they go into legislative session, it literally ends up being party politics, and really it's the hot topic issues that really positions them for whatever reelection they're seeking or whatever higher office they're seeking to be able to use that platform. And so us as Florida voters basically use the citizen initiative process as our ways to get the things that the legislators should have been giving us in the first place. And so this would have limited, and our the greatest concern that we always raised up was that we know Floridians, for some reason, when they don't understand something on the ballot, they vote yes. Rather than saying that, I don't really understand what this means, so let me vote no on it. They tend to vote yes. And so we knew that if this had passed, we were going to be doing a lot of work this election cycle to really educate voters on what this actually meant and the harm of this joint resolution if it would have actually became law. So this was a great victory, and this is something that we all should own, because there was a lot of work done to slow this bill down. And ultimately, like when I looked at a lot of the bills that were on their way to passing but didn't pass, it's almost kind of like a thank God we only have a 60-day legislative session, because ultimately they ran out of time. They ran out of time with a lot of things, and I keep hearing these different conversations of whether or not Florida should have longer legislative sessions, and it's like a no. They don't need more time. To give them more time means more damage. And so it's like a thank you. Y'all ran out of time and y'all weren't able to get to this one. And we are not like other states where wherever it ended is where they pick up the next legislative session.
They die and they have to restart.
Of Florida, it dies. They have to start all over. And so we have to, again, keep an eye out on this bill and make sure that it doesn't, if it comes back up next year, that it doesn't move an inch.
Mm-hmm. So
as
you can, so there is definitely some ugly, but there was some good. And I think that it's really a reminder that paying attention, being vocal, holding elected officials accountable, and using all the tools that are available to us to be able to track and maintain transparency are so important, whether it's really understanding what the bad bill is or slowing down and stopping even worse bills, or championing the bills that are great. So I have a love-hate relationship with legislative session because of that, because it's like, oh, like this is democracy in action. You get to really see what how the system works.
You get to see how the sausage is made, is what one of my mentors would say. You get to see how the sausage is made.
The thing that ends up being messed up is like you realize the big disconnect between what we as constituents and voters and taxpayers think are important and what these people who we voted for think
the complete
is
disconnect.
Important. Because we have so many issues, as Fran said at the top, we have so many issues that we're facing a housing crisis, we're facing an environmental crisis. There's a lot.
I mean, one of the bills that failed was the whole thing around the condos and the security measures, again, like around the surf side. And that bill failed.
Requiring them to actually be safe buildings.
Do inspections and have safe buildings, and it failed.
Save the money that people are paying into to actually only limit it to repairs. And so it's very disappointing what folks decided, what the legislators decided and the governor decided were the priorities. However, being involved does work, because look at the horrible things that we were able to stop. We're not able to stop everything, but as we get more involved and more engaged, we're able to stop more bad things from happening. So that's my little soapbox.
And then again, like it's literally been over the last 10 years. So talking to one of my mentors, Karen Woodall, who's been in the Capitol for 30 plus years, I remember her saying that this is one of the worst legislative sessions she's seen, because again, this was like, for us, when we looked at it, this was a complete disregard for what Floridians actually needed. Like in the middle, again, of a housing crisis, this economic downturn, these issues around climate, all of these layers and layers. I'm like, oh my God, again, homeowners and like seeing our home insurances skyrocketing, never filing a claim, but insurance is skyrocketing and no checks again to corporations and what they're essentially doing to consumers. They decided to prioritize all of these issues because again, this is what their base wanted from them. And so for the past 10 years, there's been like really active work around maintaining a constant presence in the Capitol. And that's essentially what's been able to, it's that accountability of like, we see you, because for a long time, nobody came up there. It was all the professional lobbyists who are basically paid to be up there. And there's been a lot of work across the state around how do we develop community lobbying force so that we doing rotations, basically shifts at the Capitol to keep an eye out on what they're doing. And there are certain people who sacrifice, 3 months out of the year to live at the Capitol, to be there full time, basically to just let us know what the heck is
What's
happening.
going
Like
on?
you have Ida, you have Chattel, you have Annie from Planned Parenthood, the people who literally uproot their lives to live at the Capitol to tell us like what is happening and tell us when we need to like activate, essentially, like when we need to get on these buses and be at the Capitol because they about to make some moves that they're planning like in the middle of the night. Here they talk about like the immigration enforcement bill that, oh, people are coming into the state in the middle of the night. And I'm like, y'all making decisions in the middle of the night that are going to harm our people. And it's because we have the resources have been growing, and I hope that they continue to grow where we can continue to have and maintain a constant presence in the Capitol so that there's accountability on both sides. Because again, no one is how do you say that? Like no one is kind of like absolved from like not having to be held accountable.
Yes.
It's work that has to be done on both sides to educate our people about the decisions that they're making and the harm that can come from that, whether intentional or unintentional. Right. We have a responsibility to break that down to them.
Well,
yeah. And so now the budget. So one of the things that happened, because people are like, why is session going into Monday? Wasn't session done on Friday, the 11th? Yes. And it's like, y'all only have one job constitutionally as the Florida legislature. Y'all only duty is the fiscal duty to pass a balanced budget. So why are we going into Monday? And part of it was because, again, the clock was running out. They had a lot of bills that they wanted to pass, and there's a 72-hour cooling off period when it comes to the budget. It's basically like the budget ends up being almost like a 500-page document. So there's like within the rules a 72-hour cooling off period, and it basically laid over into the weekend and into Monday. And so session officially had ended this past Monday, and with a historic $112 billion. But I really want people to know, again, like you can see in this headline, legislators, lawmakers in this session without, however, addressing the crisis of property insurance market, the shortage of affordable housing, a host of clean water issues. And there was about $37 billion in federal monies that helped basically with this $112 billion budget. And so there's a lot of things that are being discussed within the budget. We know that there's going to be some teacher raises. There's going to be some boosts to the minimum wage for state workers to $15 an hour. We know that one of the things that I was kind of like, it's in the budget, we don't know if the governor will actually approve it, is a $645 million plan to construct almost 5,000 beds for a new prison. We know that there's the relief money that had came down for school districts, over $200 million. But remember, there was a threat that the school districts who didn't maintain that mask, the anti-mask mandate, basically, that the governor had pushed last year, they stand to potentially lose that $200 million, which includes Miami-Dade County, Broward, and Hillsborough. And so, and at the same time, the governor, we know redistricting is a huge component of it, but there's a lot of money that's coming down the pipe, and there's a lot of decisions that are going to be made. And so essentially now, the budget still hasn't gotten to the governor, but when it does get to the governor has 3 options that he can take when it comes to the vetoes. The governor can sign the bill into law, and normally bills that he signs into law, he does these huge ceremonial press conferences with a whole signing of like people standing behind him. He's actually been doing them throughout the week. And he also, you can also allow the bill to become law without his signature. And so he basically just lets it sit and becomes law. And then the other option is ultimately that he can veto it. And by vetoing it, he basically is like, I don't want this bill to become law. And the only way that y'all can bypass my veto is by having a 2/3 vote in the legislature. So those are essentially the three actions that the governor can take when it comes to bills making their way to his desk.
And I believe the last day for bills to de facto become law if he doesn't sign it is July 1st.
Yes,
So,
yeah, because
so
it's like basically
if
they're going to
something
be
passed
making,
and he doesn't
yeah,
veto it, it automatically becomes law July 1st.
yeah,
And then
because they're all slowly making their way to his desk.
and
And as you can see from here with these headlines, is that the governor has made it very clear, I'm making certain vows to veto certain things. And so one of the things we know is, again, like we said, that there's certain things in the budget. And from what I was reading from all of the different articles was kind of like the governor felt that the negotiations were way too generous. And so we may see some line item, because usually he can choose to veto the budget, he can choose to approve the budget, or he can choose to go line by line to just be like, nope, nope, yes, nope, 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 nope. And so we know that there's a lot of trading that happens on the floor of like, I'll vote for this if you give me this on the budget. But at the same time, at the end of the day, the final vote rests with the governor. And so he's basically been saying that he's warning of cuts to the budget. And in that same breath is his almost kind of like promise to veto the congressional boundary act. So we know that in Florida, out of what is it, 27 congressional districts, we only have 4 in the entire state of Florida that are Black.
No, now we're going up to 28 because we got
no, but the current we have 4 Black congressional members. So just imagine that the maps that the governor proposed would erase 2 of those seats. So we would have lost 2 congressional Black members. And basically the Republicans were like, let's just draw these maps the way that we need to draw them, because we don't want to get drawn out in court. And we know what happened last time when we were drawn out in court is that it took 6 years. And so by the time the courts made their decision, the damage was already done. And you know, and not to speculate, but it basically feels like that's what the repeat is of like let's just draw the maps the way that we want to draw them and let the courts handle it. It seems to be the kind of the common theme. And so the GOP basically was like, no, we're going to draw them the way that we need to draw them, which essentially the map is in a way protecting one of the only Black congressional seat in North Florida, which is currently held by Al Lawson. And essentially the governor's maps basically would have done away with his seat, and he would have been in a competitive seat where he basically had to fight in order to hold his seat. So we may see that being vetoed, and based off of that, it would give the Republicans a 19-9 advantage. That's a huge advantage in the state of Florida.
Yeah.
So we're just basically going to have to kind of wait and see what happens with that, because again, session ended on Monday and things are making their way very slowly to the governor. Chris, I don't know if you can click on the link that was in here, the floridagov.com.
Hold on one second.
Yeah. Because I want to show folks, like, again, we're all about like not just telling y'all, but actually kind of showing y'all these documents and knowing that y'all don't need us to tell y'all where to find things, but that y'all should just be able to find them on your own. And so one of the things that if you're ever curious of like where things are and what is the governor signing, you can go to the right-hand corner and click on the 2022 bill actions. And it keeps the constant update of what has he signed so far. So as you can see, out of what we know is hundreds of bills that were passed this session, he's only really found about 10, like about 10, 15 of them. And many of them are around executive appointments. And I believe the state symbol one was the whole, I think, strawberry shortcake basically became the state dessert. And
See,
so
which is like, I'm sorry. Like, I've never seen anybody eat. I like strawberry shortcake. I do. But I don't even see that on a restaurant menu. But okay. Anyway,
oh my gosh. Yeah. So yeah, the state
state
dessert now is a
symbols.
strawberry shortcake. But basically you can just go to this website, which is flgov.com, and you can go to that right-hand corner to basically track like what's actually happening and like what bills are actually being voted on, like actually being signed, I mean, by the governor. And so again, this is always about like y'all don't have to come to us, but y'all can use these tools for yourselves, and navigate these tools to really kind of stay informed around what's actually happening. But yeah, but that's the page. So if you want to go back to the slides, we can kind of go now to the takeaway, which we know. The takeaway, I feel like we've been kind of talking about this the entire time, but the takeaway is like they didn't really care about the people of Florida this legislative session. This legislative session was an entire setup for all of the political aspirations of members of the legislature on both sides, because again, this is not a Democrat
No
versus
party
Republican.
has
No party
majority on who on
exactly. Yeah,
failing our
of failing our people. Like because again, there were certain votes that I was watching, and I was just shocked by the Democrats and the votes that they were casting. I was shocked to see that there wasn't a consensus. When I used to be very active in the Capitol, like when I used to have to like pick up and move to live in Tallahassee, you used to see the Democrats being able to come together and have caucus positions where they said, as Democrats, we are all voting this way. And you didn't see much of that this legislative session. This legislative session, the party was completely scattered. You would see on certain issues like the immigration bill, we saw it was a bipartisan bill. People on both sides of the aisle voted in support of it. The protest, both of the protest bills that we mentioned, on both sides of the aisle, they voted for this. This was not about defending and protecting the First Amendment right. And that's what you saw across this legislative session, is that no, on both sides, again, they were not doing what was right for Floridians. And we did see, although again, we saw people fighting. We saw people fighting around HB7. And again, like our classrooms and what they're basically setting our teachers up for, what they're setting corporations up for, small business companies who, again, are focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations to really be able to talk about the racial history and the racial past and present of this country. And the abortion debate was one of the most, that was a hard one to watch, because you're hearing women in the legislature telling their stories about the decisions that they've had to make. And it was just basically completely disregarded. It's like, why are you even telling your story? Is basically kind of like basically the way that they received it. And the fact that we have to continue to tell our stories over and over, some of the most harmful, some of the most traumatic stories in our lives, immigrant children, not actually the fear of actually showing up at the Capitol, because normally we've been able to bring undocumented families to the Capitol where they would feel safe that they could tell their stories, but we couldn't bring them. We have to actually discourage people, if you didn't have a type of, whether it's permanent status or temporary legal status, to come to the Capitol, because we knew you were going to be a target. Like, that was the environment of the Capitol. The Capitol's environment, the tension, pulling children out of committee hearings, like dragging them out of committee hearings. It was so much excess force in the Capitol this year of like, this is not your Capitol and you don't belong here. And so once again, the takeaway was that they neglected and failed the people of this state. And there were, again, a lot of missed opportunities to do a lot of good, but that wasn't what was on their mind. That's not what was on their mind. I don't know, Chris, if there's anything else
I think
you want to say to that, but
you hit it
all.
Wasn't
on their mind.
I think that as we go into this year, and I know we're gonna like segue a little bit, as we go into November, I think that people should not forget what happened this legislative session, should not forget what these legislators decided to prioritize, and should not forget like the issues that actually matter to you in your day-to-day life, and see like when you're voting, or if you decide to register to vote and vote for the first time, that you actually are looking to see where people stand on those issues and what have they done. If they're an incumbent, what have they actually done? Because really our only way of changing the culture in Tallahassee is to change the occupants of that building. I think that became crystal clear to me personally this session. And it's not about, it's not even it's not, you know, we're a nonpartisan organization. It's not about a party affiliation and, oh, we need to have this party or that party. It's like people, literally the human beings that are in that building, are they aligned with your values or not? And they're not aligned with my values. And so that I think that's the call to action and the takeaway for me from this session, which was truly the worst session in 20 years. Like I've spoke with so many people who have lived in the state for 40, 50, 60 years, their whole life, and they've never seen anything like this. And the blatant disregard for us, the people who are their boss, who pay their salary, who vote for them, was like unconscionable. And to see that like you have legislators crying on the Senate floor and the House floor, like imploring their colleagues. That's not a democracy that I want to be a part of. And the only way for us to change that is to change who's in that room.
Yeah. And so we can always just say, stay connected. Because I know like there were some questions that came up and we already kind of have like wrapped them into our presentation. I know this was a lot. Like I was like, oh, let me find a GIF of like your brain, like, oh my God, my brain. It was so much. But if you want to go to the next slide, but we encourage you to stay connected with us. And there's so much work that's being cultivated within the Black Collective. Currently, we've expanded our staff. We have 3 amazing community organizers, Nate, Octavia, and Al and Valencia, who is holding it down with them and doing the day-to-day, going back to the basics of community organizing, of talking to our people and meeting them where they're at, like meeting them at their front door. And like, let's have a conversation of what are your priorities? What are the things that you're actually facing in community? What is it that you aspire? Because again, it's like remembering my Be Me fellowship of like, we need to talk from an asset framing, not a deficit framing of like, what do we aspire to? You know, like what do we know that we deserve and that we should be fighting and advocating for, and being able to really materialize that. And so when we talk about, again, contesting power, as Valencia puts it so well, is contesting power and how do we actually talk through models of self-determination. Like, again, while we focus a lot of our energy through these community conversations, which we will be upgrading this name, yes, and we will be rebranding this as something else, so stay tuned. But as we have these community conversations, really to get you all to understand the systems, the institutions, the structures, this is not where our work is. Our work is that we have the power to make a difference in our lives. We have to hold those who are in positions of power to be accountable to community, to work with community, build with community, shape agendas that are with the voices of community centered. But at the same time, we know that we don't have to wait on them to actually build thriving communities. And so when we talk about what Black self-determination looks like and what are the things that we can take the lead on, how do we organize and shape power in our communities, being rooted in political education, that is the work that we are building and moving forward. And so there's a lot of work that we're going to be doing around, like I said, if you want to come out and volunteer and knock doors with us, we literally do it on a weekly basis, 3 or 4 times a week. We're going to be crafting our voter guide, our unique one-of-a-kind voter guide that I know many people out there try to copy and paste. That was a labor of love from Christina and I that really, again, broke down who, not even the who are the people who are running, but what are the positions?
Yeah.
What are the powers behind those positions? Like, y'all have to understand that people don't put millions of dollars into a race because there's not something that they don't plan on getting out of it. And so that's what we have to be able to educate y'all on, to then figure out, like, what's the pivot to actually building Black political power here in South Florida, and hopefully throughout the rest of the state of Florida, and being able to show that there's a model that works and that we can actually build Black self-determination across this country. And so I'm very excited for the work that we're about to get ready to move forward. But just know that this is like a 3-part conversation that we just had, breaking down legislative session from the beginning to the mid-session update to now wrapping up this post-session debrief. But there is so much more work to come, and we're currently hiring for our Haitian Creole community organizer, because we need to get up in Little Haiti, we need to get up in North Miami Beach. And so if you want to be part of the team, please go to our website. You will see the job posting, and join the Black Collective team. I think that was all, Chris. I don't know if there's anything you want to say.
No, you hit everything. So definitely, I'm just going to do like the cheesy, like, follow, share, and have a good rest of your day.